Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
Hello, it's good to be back. How are you finding this week?
I'm doing well, thanks. Though, I have to say, preparing for this one has been, well, it's been a challenge. We're tackling a subject that is maybe the most difficult thing to pin down, the nature of Kötülük, or what we call badness and evil.
It really is, and this material, it gives us a framework to move beyond just gut feelings or philosophy. It pushes us into neuroscience, into evolutionary biology, to find the actual mechanism behind intentional harm.
And it really challenges that sort of comforting idea that our worst behaviors are just baked into our genes.
Exactly, because if it's not just genetics, then the problem is developmental, and that's a much harder problem to solve.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We want to give you, our listener, some clarity on this massive subject. So we have to start with the fundamental problem, right? How do we even define evil in a way that lets us talk about its mechanics?
Right. It starts by just accepting that defining it is one of the oldest problems in moral philosophy. So, for our purposes, the sources give us a very specific and operational definition.
Something we can actually work with.
Yes. Think of it like this. Evil is consciously and intentionally limiting or threatening the life or existence rights of others, usually for your own gain.
And that word, consciously, that's the key, isn't it? It separates a mistake or even a sin from a deliberate act of harm.
Precisely. The awareness, the intent, that's the crucial part. And this is the first big psychological hurdle. People who do terrible things, think of, say, large-scale financial fraud. They almost never see themselves as evil.
They build a story in their own head.
An elaborate one. They rationalize it. They might even have a kind of Robin Hood mentality telling themselves it's for some greater good.
So they're the hero of their own story, not the villain.
Exactly. But that internal story, their justification, it becomes completely irrelevant the moment you look at the damage done to others.
Which is why we have law.
Right. The whole function of law is to protect the victim, the modder. It's not there to validate the perpetrator's feelings about what they did. If you were harmed, their internal logic doesn't matter.
And of course, what's considered bad changes. It shifts with culture, with time. A small homogeneous tribe can agree on the rules pretty easily.
Life, food, shelter, sure. But in our huge modern societies, that consensus just falls apart.
So we need a more universal principle.
We do. And the one favored in this analysis is, it's incredibly practical. It's a philosophical standard that basically asks one question.
Okay.
Does this action support the vitality, diversity, and beauty of life? If yes, it's good. If it does the opposite, then you're looking at evil.
That's a powerful metric. You could apply that to anything. From a corporate decision to how you treat someone in traffic, it creates a shared objective ground.
It does. So if we accept that, the next question is, where does this harm come from? If it's not just bad genes, what is it?
And this is where it gets really counterintuitive. The sources are pretty clear. When you look at adults, society and culture and trauma bear way more responsibility than biology.
Which puts everything on development and environment. But the really mind-bending part is about consciousness itself.
Right, the paradox.
Yeah.
That evil isn't caused by consciousness, but by the lack of it. How does that even work?
Well, it's about how our brains are wired to be efficient. Think about your day. Neuropsychologically, over 90% of what you do, your decisions, your actions, they're all automatic, unconscious.
Right, consciousness is expensive. It takes a lot of energy.
A huge amount. So it only really switches on when you're in a totally new situation or doing some really complex planning or when you're surprised.
It's the brain's autopilot. I'm not really thinking about driving to the store. I'm just driving.
You're just doing it. And when that autopilot is running, its programming comes from your past. If your childhood wired you to see threats everywhere, to react with self-protection,
then your autopilot will default to selfish or aggressive actions without a second thought.
Without any conscious review at all. The system just runs the old destructive program. This is why consciousness is called a noble feature. It's the tool that lets you interrupt that automatic cycle.
The ability to pause and choose a different path.
To choose not to return harm 100 times over. And the lack of people able to do that, to use conscious reflection, that's cited as one of the world's single biggest problems.
Okay, but we still have to acknowledge that aggression, violence, these things are part of our nature. They're biological reality.
Of course, just like breathing or eliminating waste. The key isn't to eliminate them, it's about control and purpose. Aggression is just a tool. For self-defense, it's vital. Misused, it's abuse.
And to understand how we first developed those controls, we have to look back, evolutionarily.
To our primate cousins, yes. Chimpanzees are a great baseline. They have instinctive social rules. They'll punish someone who cheats the alpha, for sure.
But also for not sharing, right?
Critically, for not sharing high-value food, like meat, a hunter who keeps it all for himself faces serious punishment. This isn't some high-minded moral law. It's a survival adaptation. It ensures calories get to the whole group, especially mothers and infants.
And you see that same instinct for fairness in that famous capuchin monkey experiment. It's like a tiny labor dispute in a cage.
It's incredible to watch. You have two monkeys doing the same task. One gets a slice of cucumber, fine. The other one gets a much better reward.
And the first monkey sees this.
And it loses its mind. It gets angry. It bangs the cage. It throws the cucumber back at the researcher. It is a raw, visceral reaction to perceived injustice.
It's basically saying, no way. I'm not working for cucumber wages when he's getting the great bonus.
Exactly. It's an untaught, hardwired system demanding fairness. That is the seed of all our legal systems. But that instinct was only enough for small tribes.
Once we started farming, owning property, building cities, it got too complicated.
Way too complicated. So we had to create external rules, formal laws, codes, punishments. Our modern hukuk, that instinct for justice had to be formalized because our world outgrew it.
Yet even with all those laws, the sources point to this frustrating, repeating cycle. Humans build things up, get comfortable, and then commit stupidities that bring the world down upon their heads. It points to a kind of deep-seated immaturity in our species. A tragic flaw in Homo sapiens. And the analysis identifies the engine of that immaturity in the modern world. Post-truth. Hakikatin onem sais les tirolmesi.
The trivialization of reality itself.
This is the idea that objective standards are just gone. The person with the most followers or the loudest voice is right, even if what they're saying is demonstrably false.
And when you lose that shared ground, the consequences are catastrophic. Ethical frameworks just evaporate. The main goal for huge parts of society becomes purely profit-driven, or karadoklem.
And if profit is the only goal, you lose your harmony with nature. It's no longer a living system we're part of, it's just a resource to be stripped.
Which fuels our ecological crises. And society itself becomes focused on short-term gain with no shared purpose beyond money. The diagnosis is pretty stark.
Humanity is immature.
Essentially, yes. Homo sapiens hasn't yet grown up enough to handle its own power. We are, right now, the only species on Earth that causes this level of systemic damage to the entire planet without restraint.
And what's so disturbing is that our current system actively promotes this immaturity because it's profitable.
It's the core of it. The model of an individual who is a slave to every feeling, every impulse, that's what's sold to you as freedom. But real maturity is impulse control.
So the system keeps people reactive, emotional, stuck on that unconscious autopilot.
Because a reactive, unconscious consumer is a highly profitable one.
So this is a bleak picture.
Yeah.
But if it's driven by culture and lack of consciousness, can it be fixed? Can bad people be changed?
From a neuroscientific perspective, the answer is a clear yes. Barring some kind of severe brain damage, humans have neuroplasticity. We learn, we change our entire lives.
So any belief or behavior that led to harm can, in theory, be retrained.
It can, which is why our current correctional systems are such a catastrophic failure. They do the exact opposite of what the science tells us to do.
They focus on isolation.
Overwhelmingly. And experts have been shouting for decades that isolation is counterproductive. It makes aggressive people more aggressive. It makes psychopaths more psychopathic. You don't learn empathy by being cut off from all human contact.
So the actual cure is the opposite of a prison cell.
It's social integration. It's establishing strong, meaningful social bonds. Our brains are wired for a small, trusted circle of 5 to 10 people. That's our neurological safe zone.
But we've traded that for the illusion of connection. Millions of followers, thousands of likes.
Which leaves people profoundly lonely and insecure, and that directly contributes to this rise in Kötülük.
And our legal system often seems more focused on vengeance, on making the victim feel better, than on fixing the problem that caused the crime.
And that focus on revenge is completely unsustainable in a world of 8 billion people. We have to address the root cause. A human being doesn't just decide to cause immense harm one day. Something in their system is broken. We have to treat the brokenness, not just punish the symptom.
This brings us to education then. It's supposed to be the great preventative measure, but so often fails. We see highly educated people committing the worst ethical crimes. Why?
Because of that old saying, education removes ignorance, but foolishness remains. Our system is designed to transmit information, facts, skills.
But not wisdom.
Not maturity, not impulse control. It doesn't teach you how to develop the conscious reflection needed to act ethically on the information you have, and that is the missing piece.
We have covered so much ground here, from monkeys demanding fair pay to the collapse of objective truth. And it seems the core mechanism isn't some deep-seated malice, but a deficit of conscious control.
Exactly. It's a deficit driven by a primitive social structure we just haven't outgrown. We have the scientific and philosophical solutions, social integration, focusing on root causes, using that noble feature of consciousness. We know what to do.
But we struggle to actually implement it.
We seem to lack the collective maturity as a species to consistently act on our own best knowledge.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this?
It means the capacity for good or for bad isn't fixed. It's trainable. It depends entirely on our culture and on how effectively we learn to use our own minds. We're at a point where we know how to build a better world, but our primitive, impulse-driven autopilot is still flying the plane.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. If we as humans have the knowledge to build a better system but consistently fail to do it because we can't control our own primitive impulses, are we really worried about evil? Or are we just facing the fundamental systemic immaturity of the species Homo sapiens? Something for you to consider.